Hi guys, welcome to Make to Explore YouTube channel. First of all, we thank all our subscribers and viewers for all the support and encouragement you have given to us. Now let's unbox our Raspberry Pi Pico MCU Development Board, which comes in this type of packaging with no pre-soldered header. You can see here, this is a Raspberry Pi Pico version 2020. Okay, we have just unboxed our Raspberry Pi Pico. Now we'll see how to solder the headers to the Raspberry Pi Pico. So when you unpacked your Raspberry Pi Pico, you notice that it is completely flat. There are no metal pins sticking out from the sides or edges. You can see here, comes with this type of packaging. It do not have headers solder. So we need to solder the header. If you want to use your Pico to interface with another circuitry, you will have to mount it on a solderless breadboard. For that you will require this pin headers. So here you will require two 20 pin 2.54 mm male header strips. Let's see how to solder these pins. Sometimes these 2.54 mm headers comes longer packaging, like it has a longer than 20 pins up to 40 pins. So you have to snap it to up to 20 pins and took two headers, because you require two strips exactly of 20 pins, because our Raspberry Pi Pico is of 40 pins. Now let's see how to solder, but before that, here is the warning. Soldering irons are not toys. They get very hot and stay hot for a long time after they are unplugged. So if you are younger and learner, make sure that you have adult supervision. Whether you are young or old, make sure that you should put your soldering iron into the stand when you are not using it, and you should never ever touch the metal parts even after it's unplugged, because soldering iron get very hot, up to 300 to 800 degrees Celsius hot, and if you touch that any metal part, you will get burned. So you should take care of that. Now let's see how to solder. For that, attach the headers. You can use a sticky putty like this shown in the image to hold the headers, or you can use the easiest method here. It is a solderless breadboard. You can put the two headers on that solderless breadboard and then put your Raspberry Pi Pico in this way, and you can solder now easily. Here you have to first solder the corner pins first. Over this corner, this one, and this one, because you need some structural strength to other pins. If you solder these 4 pins, other pins will get easily soldered. There is no difficulty in that. So here is the one warning also. Soldering is a great skill to learn, but it does take practice. Read all the instruction carefully before soldering or turning on your soldering iron on. Remember, take the things very slowly and carefully. Avoid using too much solder, because if you use too much solder, it is very difficult to take that solder away, excess solder. And you should take care of these parts also. These are very tiny little parts, you can see here. If you touch any part with your soldering iron, it will get removed from this PCB and your Raspberry Pi Pico will get damaged. So to avoid that, you should take very care here during soldering. Here also one warning. Molded solder is made of without a lead, but it is still poisonous. It is a special substance in that it is called as a flux, and this corrosive gel which serves you burn dirt away from the joints as you are soldering. It won't harm you if you get it on fingers, but it could make you ill if you were eat it. Only handle the solder when you are actively using it, and please always wash your hands afterwards, especially before you eat anything. So you should take care of that. Now let's see how to solder. So here they have given the procedure. You should first heat the pad and pin. Okay, heat the pin and pad first, and then add a little solder here. This is a soldering flux. You have to add little solder here. If you hit that, it will look like this, and you should solder like this only. This is a well solder pin as shown in figure here. So you do not solder like this A, B, C, D, E. This is a different types of soldering, which is soldering errors, we can say. This is a excess soldering. There are bulge of solder here. This is a very little soldering, and this is also very little or insufficient soldering. This is excess soldering where solder flux or soldering metal get burned here. You can see it is a black. This is a short circuit soldering. 2 pins get shorted. So avoid these types of errors during soldering. We will give this document in our GitHub page, or you can download it from Raspberry Pi Pico's official website and take all this instruction carefully and solder your Raspberry Pi Pico headers. Now let's see, it's a demo how to solder the headers. Now let's solder the headers to the Raspberry Pi Pico as we have seen earlier in this video in Raspberry Pi Magazine's PDF guide. That will require all these components like soldering iron and its stand, soldering metal, solderless breadboard, and two 2.54 mm 20 pin header strips, male header strips. So when you unpack your Raspberry Pi Pico, you will notice that it is completely flat with no any attachment. Raspberry Pi Pico to attach male header strips 2.54 mm 20 pins each male header strips to both the sides, because our Raspberry Pi Pico is of 40 pins. It will help us to attach or interface other peripherals and circuitry to this board easily using jumper wires. So put these male header strips on solderless breadboard like this. You can put both strips parallelly like this, and then place your Raspberry Pi Pico on it. This will help us in a tedious task of holding the header and then soldering each and every pin one by one. So you have a quick note here. When you solder, you should solder all 4 corner pin first, because it will help us keep Pico steady during soldering of other pins. When you solder other pins, it will not move. So you have to solder corner pin first and then solder other pins one by one. And when you solder all the pins, Pico will look like this.